morning, beloved of God. This is the day that God has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. Welcome to the Kent United Church of Christ, an open and affirming and accessible to all congregation, proclaiming God's good news of grace and love. Whoever you are, wherever you are on life's journey, you are welcome here. For we do not come as perfect people, but as people perfectly loved by God.
Please rise in body and our spirit. The one who is love is our firm foundation. In times of loss and times of abundance, God upholds us. Though we may be afraid, we will not be abandoned. Though the path may be unclear, the Spirit will guide. Though the journey is long, we go together. Let the people of God take heart. We rejoice in the assurance of God with us. Defender of the exploited, protector of the vulnerable, help us to see clearly in this time of chaos. Do not let us be deceived. Where we are harming or being harmed, give us the courage to disrupt systems of violence and evil in all their forms. Through our hands, our hearts, our community, may thy kingdom come. Amen.
We gather in this sacred place to worship and glorify Jesus Christ, who opposed violence, always chose compassion, and embodied peace and justice in all he did and said. And so we share a sign of that peace with one another as a visible sign of our loving kindness. May the peace of Christ be with you always.
A reading from the Hebrew Bible, the book of Ruth, the 3rd chapter, verses 1 through 5, and the 4th chapter, verses 13 through 17. Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, "My daughter, I need to seek some security for you, so that it may be well with you. Now here is our kinsman Boaz, with whose young woman you have been working. See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Now wash and anoint yourself, and put on your best clothes, and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, observe the place where he lies. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do." She said to her, "All that you tell me, I will do." So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. When they came together, the Lord made her conceive, and she bore a son. Then the woman said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without next of kin, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has borne him." Then Naomi took the child and laid him in her bosom and became his nurse. The woman of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." They named him Obed. He became the father of Jesse, the father of David. Here ends the reading from God's word. Thanks be to God, who is still speaking.
Well, if you haven't heard, there is an exodus of refugees from Central America making their way through Mexico in hopes of making it to the United States. This migrant caravan, as it has been commonly referred to, is just one of many migrations of people that have sought a better life in this, the land of the free, over the past few decades and longer. This is not a new phenomenon. People living in misery and fear have long believed and found that there is something better in store for them. And every one of these people has a name, a face, and a story. Alba is part of this mass migration. Her husband, a former soldier in the Honduran army, has survived 3 attempts on his life. He has applied for asylum in the US, and now Alba is trying to join him and their son. David and Scarlett left their home in Honduras, where they were being constantly harassed by gangs and without job opportunities. Scarlett felt she had no choice but to leave behind a 2-year-old daughter with her grandmother, hoping against hope that if she could just make it to the US, she would be able to support that daughter. Kaidi joined the caravan with her 2 small children after her husband abandoned them. She feared she is doomed to poverty and decided to risk the treacherous trip to the United States to create a better life for her beloved children. Neri is making the trek in his new wheelchair after limping through Guatemala. Finally, someone offers him a wheelchair when he arrives in the capital city. His legs were lost while riding the Beast, the nickname of the northern-bound cargo train that runs through Mexico. Determined to escape the violence and lack of health care in his own country, this is his 2nd attempt to reach the US. Marel is a young man who just wants more than anything, as he put it, to pay for treatment for his mother's health. He longs to build a home for her and perhaps one day be able to invest in something or even start a business for his mom to run. Poverty and violence. Poverty and violence. These are the primary reasons people from Central America migrate to the US. What has long been perceived as a promised land, the only thing the US is now promising, if and when our sisters and brothers arrive, is a militarized and closed border. Little do they yet realize that when they finally make it here, after months and months of travel, on foot, no less, that they will not be greeted with open arms, with a young boy by the name of Gabe Mothersbaugh, who is able to say, whoever you are, wherever you are on life's journey, you are welcome here. No, not radical hospitality or extravagant welcome, but rather fear masked in the form of ignorance, prejudice, and hostility. These courageous pilgrims most likely did not know that our midterm elections were this past week. I'm sure they do not have our political processes and events on their radar as they embarked on the long, arduous, and dangerous journey to what they hope will be freedom and prosperity. They are making this trek because they feel they have no other choice. Can you imagine your living conditions so dire, your family so desperate, your neighborhood so dangerous, your life so deplorable that leaving it all behind and walking for months on end without the assurance you would arrive becomes the better option? If you knew that health care, adequate food, clean water, less crime, and a democratic society was not far from you, yes, even relatively speaking, within walking distance, would you remain living in fear or take the risk of restoring life for you and your family, even if that meant finding your way as a stranger in a strange land? The book of Ruth was written during similar unsettled times in ancient Israel. Leaders like Ezra and Nehemiah were bound and determined to reestablish the nation by purifying themselves and their people of any idol worship or foreign gods. Marrying a foreigner would have not only been frowned upon, it was a sign that you were unclean. Ethnic cleansing would be the watchword. Only the racially pure were welcome there. And yet Ruth, the Moabite, the foreigner, finds a home in Bethlehem with her mother-in-law, Naomi, to whom she was devoted and promised to follow wherever she went, even if that meant Ruth would be perceived as the unclean, the outsider, and undeserving of a better life. But it is precisely Ruth the Moabite who becomes the wife of Boaz and who eventually gives birth to a son, Obed, who will become the grandfather of David, Israel's greatest king. Oh, and while we're at it, let's remind the political leaders of ancient Israel, Ezra and Nehemiah, and their purification party, that the King of Kings, Jesus the Christ, is none other than David's descendant. Yes, the greatest of all was born of a refugee, a migrant, an outsider, a poor and destitute widow with the courage to risk it all, crossing borders of race, religion, class, and gender. The Moabite woman who seemed such a liability for Naomi at the beginning of their journey has become the means of her redemption. As Robert Williamson writes, this Moabite woman has given her more security than 7 sons. A high compliment in ancient Israel. The Hebrew word chesed means loving kindness or steadfast love. Judaism has long referred to Ruth as the book of chesed or the book of loving kindness because the story of Naomi and Ruth is one of profound kindness and a steadfast commitment to loyalty and love in their highest forms. The Jewish concept of chesed includes the acceptance of the stranger in its definition of kindness. So chesed is not just some random act, but the very essence of loving kindness, which is at the heart of hospitality, extravagant welcome, courageous compassion, and the embrace of the outsider. Ruth and Naomi's soul friendship, their relationship sheds light on the human partnership between God and God's people. That God chooses women as the protagonists here. Women who were second-class citizens and certainly not those at the center, but rather on the margins, is a critical element in the story's power and message. Ruth and Naomi had agency. They shifted the power structure by taking matters into their own hands, loving each other through thick and thin, living out their commitment to one another. And without that steadfast love, the lifeline of Israel's history, stretching from Judah to David, would be cut off in the death and separation of the fields of Moab. But I've always been fascinated that throughout this book of Ruth, we actually never hear God's voice. Did you notice? God does not speak for God's self in the text. And you may want to go home and read this book again. It's short. But we sense God's presence only indirectly. The name of God uttered in the prayers spoken by the characters in the story. But God is undoubtedly there. We know that. And as philosopher David Hartman claims, the God of Israel relies on humans to embody God's uncompromising commitment to safeguard human freedom and integrity. In other words, God's mission, God's vision of shalom can only come to fruition with human cooperation. God intersects with the characters of the book of Ruth the way many of us experience God today, not as a divine physical presence, not as a booming voice from heaven, not as a visible mover of events, but as the one to whom we attribute some amount of agency in our own circumstances, as well as those of the world at large, writes Cameron Howard of Luther Seminary. The God of Israel is the God of history, whose presence and actions we trace through the ancient texts. Just like the Israelites, Ruth and Naomi and Boaz and the prophets of old, God relies on God's people, on us, to fulfill divine purposes. The main characters, the central characters here are the widow, the orphan, the poor, and the stranger, and Boaz, the one at the center who welcomed and even married the foreigner. Can you imagine, Frederique? They take center stage in God's story. And thus, they take center stage in ours as people of faith, as those who profess to follow the one who was himself poor and a refugee. We are called to care for the widow and the orphan, feed the hungry, bind up blistered feet that have been on a long journey, and welcome the stranger. Never ever forgetting that we too have been strangers once in the land of Egypt. This is our story. We were those outsiders who were welcomed in with extravagant hospitality. And we are those our sisters and brothers crossing Mexico are now relying on to receive them with that same chesed, that same loving kindness, that same steadfast love. As Leviticus goes on to say, the stranger who resides with you shall be to you as one of your citizens. You shall love them as yourself, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. For I am the Lord your God. The chesed that Ruth and Naomi, as soul friends, demonstrated, compelled all those around them to act out of that same abundant goodness, overflowing generosity, and steadfast love. What are you not welcoming across the borders of your heart? Who are you not allowing in? What are you not letting in? Or perhaps there is a border you are not willing to cross. What is holding you back from going after a new life? May the God of Ruth, the God of accompaniment, move you to welcome just as you have been welcomed. As we go, may we be renewed in our commitment to chesed, offering loving kindness, extravagant welcome, and abundant goodness to the poor, the widow, the orphan, and the stranger, looking always for the chance to further the cause of our neighbors and seeking every opportunity in small and extravagant ways to contribute to the healing of the world. God, our Creator, our Redeemer, and our Sustainer, goes with us on this journey. Amen.